Hello everybody and welcome back to Teachers Talk Money, where I help teachers master their money in order to give back to themselves. Today I'm going to be talking about my top 5 favorite personal finance podcasts. I love podcasts, and I would actually say that personal finance podcasts are probably not even like the main genre of podcast I listen to. I get most of my self-education for all different topics from podcasts. And I love them so much because they fit so well into my day. I love obviously getting self-education from YouTube videos and books and documentaries, but none of those things are things that I can do while I'm commuting to work or on a long car ride or walking my dog or exercising or cleaning the house. And while I don't listen to that many personal finance podcasts anymore, these were a huge part of my beginning financial journey, and all of the podcasts I'm going to list today are ones that I still listen to. And I love listening to personal finance podcasts still. Again, it's not what I mostly listen to, but I love getting hot takes on personal finance topics. I love the intellectual conversation about these topics, and sometimes I even learn something new. So I'm just gonna get this out of the way. Obviously, my top podcast recommendation is Teachers Talk Money if you're a teacher. Yes, I am plugging it as the number one first podcast I talk about because I genuinely believe in it that much, and I think it is so instructional, so specific to teachers who are interested in managing their money. And so if you're a teacher, that's number one. But I'm not gonna talk anymore about that because I don't wanna plug it for too long. The next personal finance podcast I want to plug is Brown Ambition. This is one of my favorite podcasts. It has a really great balance between talking about like an overarching topic or idea that's on the mind of one of the hosts, either Tiffany or Mandy, and then going into really specific how-to on personal finance through like listener question and answer format. So I really like that because a lot of these podcasts either do the how-to part really well, or they do the ideological, intellectual conversation piece really well, and this podcast does an excellent mix of both. Tiffany, who is also the Budgetnista, is amazing, and she and Mandy do a really great job of being really, really engaging, and it really feels like you're listening in on a conversation between two friends. And I love that they center Black women in their content. If you're a Black woman, I assume that this would be affirming and validating to listen to. But if you are non-Black, I think it's also really wonderful to have content that centers somebody else's perspective, because at least as white people, if you're white, we already have content that centers us. In fact, I would say 90% of personal finance content centers white people, even white women. I think sometimes white people are hesitant to listen to content like this because they don't think that it is for them. And again, in some ways it kind of isn't, because it's not centering our narratives or our stories. But just because it is by Black and brown people does not mean that it is only for Black and brown people. I have learned so much from Brown Ambition, and I think that anybody listening would. The next podcast I want to talk about is The Fairer Cents. This has got to be one of my favorite podcasts of all time. It is such a great intersectional deep dive into the way that money management affects all women. Tanya Hester is one of the hosts. She wrote a really great book on early retirement called Work Optional. And Cara Perez is one of my favorite people to follow on Instagram because she is incredibly informative, incredibly well-researched, and super funny. And her Instagram is @WeBravelyGo. This podcast is so well-researched and so thorough. I cannot possibly overstate the quality that goes into this podcast, and is just so apparent through and through. I will say this does not focus on like the how-to of personal finance in most episodes. It more is Tanya and Cara talking about these overarching ideas about money management and women. And like I said, they do a really phenomenal job being incredibly inclusive and incredibly intersectional, and I really think that they deserve all the awards for that. So every time I listen to this, it feels affirming, it feels informative, and it feels eye-opening. I think they have 4 seasons out now. I don't know if they're going to make another one, but I really hope so because I love it. I love their dynamic. It actually reminds me a lot of Maya and Christy's dynamic on Teachers Talk Money because, like me and Christy, they're 2 women from 2 different generations, and they have very similar values about big picture things and then disagree in some interesting ways too. And I also want to say, obviously this is a personal finance podcast by women and it is about women's money issues, but once again, that does not mean that it is only for women. Anybody listening to this can get so much out of their conversations. The next podcast I want to talk about is the Financial Confessions. This is a podcast from the Financial Diet, which, as I think you guys probably know because I mention it all the time, one of my all-time favorite resources for money management, and honestly, probably the main influence for me getting into money management while I was in college. Again, this is less of a how-to and more of a deep dive into the particular stories of whoever is being interviewed. And I will say I think they do a really good job of including super diverse and interesting and niche perspectives on all kinds of different topics. I also love how this podcast is more conversational than like interviewee feeling, which I don't always like in a podcast. Like sometimes I am looking for like a really good interview, but with this one, I think because Chelsea Fagan, who is the CEO of the Financial Diet, is the host, and she is just one of the most bright thinkers, so articulate. I feel so interested in all of her takes on things, and so I really, really love that she engages herself in the conversation and can sort of riff off of whatever the interviewee is talking about as well. So this podcast, I would say, feels like listening in on a conversation in like the college library. Like it's not like listening on a convo between 2 friends like Brown Ambition would be. It's not like the super thorough, well-researched aspect that you would get with the Fairer Sense. It's kind of just like listening in on like intellectuals conversing. It reminds me a lot of my college days. And finally, I wanted to talk about the Afford Anything podcast. I love this podcast. I would say this one definitely focuses mostly on how-tos. It's very actionable. Paula does interview episodes and she is a phenomenal interviewer, asks amazing questions, definitely more of an interview than a conversation. And then she also does listener Q&A episodes where it's very much somebody asking, what do I do with this money? And she like tells them all of their options. And I really love that. I will say, I feel like this is the one I learn the most like rote personal finance knowledge from. And I will say this is also maybe more of a personal finance 2.0 podcast because they get super into the nitty-gritty details of like really specific things. Lately, she's also actually had Joe Saul-Sehy as her co-host. He has a podcast as well, a Stacking Benjamins podcast, but I have not listened to it yet, so I can't necessarily recommend, but he's super funny and engaging too, and I feel like they make a really good pair. The entire idea behind the Afford Anything podcast is that you can afford anything, but not everything. And so it's all about sort of deciding exactly what you value and then putting your money there. And really making money decisions after life decisions. So not just necessarily doing something that will amass you the most money, but instead using your money in a way that's going to create the life you want. And so I love, love, love that intentional aspect of it. So those are my top personal finance podcast recommendations. Teachers Talk Money, number 1, Brown Ambition, the Fairer Sense, the Financial Confessions, and the Afford Anything podcast. I hope you guys enjoyed these recommendations. If you have another podcast recommendation, please put it in the comments below. I would love to hear from you, and I'm always looking for new and interesting podcasts to listen to. Don't forget to like this video, don't forget to subscribe, don't forget to do all that stuff. I hope you guys all have an amazing week, and I will see you in the next video. Bye!